While listening to this story, write in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. They say that in the winter of 1900, the Coldridge Valley in rural Missouri seemed to be living a few years behind the rest of the country. While the big cities were already talking about electricity, telegraphs, and new railroad tracks, down there, time was still marked by the bell of the small church, the distant whistle of a blacksmith, and the creaking of wagons descending the dirt road. It is from this place, and this precise year, that fragmented records emerge about two identical brothers with long faces and stiff postures, Elias and Abram Remmington. In official documents, they appear only as the Remmington twins, owners of a large two-story wooden house built on sloping ground, with a deep basement dug into the lower part of the hillside. But in later testimonies, collected decades later, that house comes to be called by another name, the Remmington House. And the basement, in particular, is given a name that still causes discomfort today when it appears on yellowed papers, Purity Basement. The Remmington House was not just a residence. According to notes lost in personal diaries, letters from residents, and a county inventory, it functioned as a kind of community shelter, makeshift boarding house, and meeting place for families passing through, lumber workers, widows without relatives, and people who, for whatever reason, had nowhere to stay during the winter. Coldridge Valley was small, a few scattered houses, a general store, the sawmill shed, the simple church with the cemetery next door. The Remmington House was, in many ways, the quiet heart of that place. The twins were described as upright, reserved men of few words. Elias, the older by a few minutes, took care of the accounts, the comings and goings of supplies, and the records of who slept in each room. Abram, on the other hand, seemed to have an easier time dealing with people. He is remembered in oral accounts as someone who listened quietly, who observed more than he spoke, and who possessed a disconcerting calm in the face of the small daily dramas of those who sought shelter in the house. Nothing in the few preserved testimonies suggests violence, scandal, or openly strange behavior. On the contrary, almost all accounts began with the same phrase, repeated by witnesses who did not even know each other. They were men of order. In the winter of that year, county records indicate that 39 people were formerly associated with the Remmington House. The number appears in a table, almost erased by moisture stains, next to columns that indicated permanent residents, boarders, and temporary guests. There are no full names there, just a few surnames: Carter, Mulligan, Harlow, Finch. In another book stored in a metal box in the basement of the county courthouse, one can find loose scribbles. A child identified only as Emma, 9 years old, an elderly man noted as Mr. Walsh, severe rheumatism, and a woman described as Widow L, without her surname being preserved. What could be seen around the house in those days was a hard but organized daily life. There are mentions of clothes hung on makeshift clotheslines between the porch and a large tree, the sound of footsteps upstairs before dawn, the smell of thick soup boiling in large iron pots, and the routine of keeping the stove lit throughout the night so that no one would wake up shivering from the cold. It was a shelter made of wood, smoke, and discipline. The Purity Basement, however, appears in the documents very differently from the rest of the house. In a notebook attributed to Elias, there is a rudimentary drawing of the floor plan of the property, in which the basement is surrounded by a thicker line of ink, almost as if it were a separate square, detached from the rest of the structure. Next to it, a single word in capital letters: Purity. There is no explanation. In one of the margins, someone, perhaps years later, added in pencil, Meetings. Ahead, on another page, there is something even stranger. A list of dates and times, always in the late afternoon or early evening, accompanied by only 2 letters, PB. When one looks at the set of records, church minutes, warehouse notes, newspaper clippings, intercepted correspondence between relatives of residents, the image that emerges is that of a full house, but one governed by a strict routine. The idea of purity appears here and there in comments by third parties, as if it were a word repeated by the Remmings in everyday conversation. They said that in that basement we learned to be better. A woman who had stayed in the house for a few months with her 2 young children confessed many years later. Her testimony was not recorded on audio, of course, but the transcript made by a researcher in the 1960s gives a glimpse of the discomfort she still felt when remembering the place. The surrounding community, for its part, seemed to accept the existence of the Purity basement with a mixture of respect and distance. Neighbors rarely went down there. In the few external accounts, the basement is described as a space that was always clean, with whitewashed walls, aligned shelves, and wooden benches leaning against the back. Sometimes, a low chant without a clear melody could be heard from inside, or the slow voice of one of the twins. At other times, there was only silence. A silence so dense that, as a local merchant wrote in a letter to a cousin, it seemed as if the earth had swallowed the sound. The scenery of the Coldridge Valley completed this atmosphere. Pine forests cutting across the horizon, narrow paths between the trees, the river flowing slowly below, carrying logs dragged from the sawmill. The winter of 1900 was particularly dry in that region, according to surviving weather records. Less snow than expected, more nights of icy wind cutting through the skin, and a strange feeling that this was a year of transition, as the pastor of the small church wrote in his New Year's homily. It is based on these fragments that today we attempt to reconstruct not only the setting but also the psychological weight of that environment. A house full of people from different places, each with a story and a reason for being there. 2 brothers responsible for imposing rules, schedules, silence, and purity. A basement with a name engraved in bold letters. And a small community that watched everything from a distance without the courage to interfere too much. For decades, the case of the 39 residents of the Remmington house was nothing more than a local rumor, a story whispered on porches with no concrete evidence. Until at the end of the 20th century, a researcher found, among dusty boxes in the county archives, a set of pages stuck together by moisture. As he carefully separated them, he realized that they contained a kind of internal census of the house, probably made by Elias. A list of names, approximate ages, origins, and observations. The numbers ranged from 1 to 39. Each line began with a name and ended with a blank space ready for future comments. The strange thing is that, just below that last line, someone drew a thick horizontal line, as if closing an account or a chapter. And in smaller letters, almost invisible at first glance, they wrote, "Purity Basement, all present." There is no date, no time, no indication of a specific event. Just that dry sentence, at the end of a page that, from there on, remains blank. It was this small detail, lost in the footer of a forgotten document, that sparked the warning that something much bigger could have happened that winter. Something that would explain why, from a certain point on, none of the 39 names reappear in any other official record of the Coldridge Valley. To understand the disappearance of the 39 residents of the Remmington house, we must go back a few weeks before the last confirmed mention that they were all alive. The preserved records, incomplete letters, diary excerpts, shopping notes, and oral accounts collected decades later allow us to reconstruct, albeit partially, what daily life was like inside the house in the early winter of 1900. Mornings always began with the sound of the wooden door opening and closing as Elias made his silent rounds on the ground floor. He checked the stove, collected the firewood left on the porch, and checked to see if the buckets of water brought from the river had frozen overnight. Abram appeared shortly after, lighting a lamp to illuminate the narrow hallway. One of the oldest testimonials, given by a woman who had stayed at the house 2 years earlier, describes this moment as the first breath of the house, when everything seemed to awaken from a long night of restraint. The families staying there faced different realities, but shared a common feeling of transience. There were woodworkers waiting for new contracts, mothers with small children from neighboring counties, wives separated from husbands who had migrated west. Each carried their own silences, but the Remmings seemed to know how to manage these coexistences with an almost ritualistic discipline. In the collected accounts, There are frequent mentions of the strict routines set by the twins. At 6 in the morning, everyone had to be awake. At 8, the first meal was served, a thin vegetable soup or hot oatmeal, always accompanied by a brief moment of reading, usually done by Elias, who read excerpts from old books found in the son of itinerant pastors. They called this moment adjustment, a word repeated in more than one account. The morning adjustment is to align the spirit, wrote one resident in a letter that was never sent. Although discipline was constant, the days in the house were also marked by small gestures of care. Abram is described as someone who helped children put on their boots on colder days, who adjusted blankets on the shoulders of the elderly, and who listened with unusual attention to the complaints of guests. At a time when few men showed this kind of public delicacy, his attitude is remembered as almost paternal. Still, there was something that all witnesses seemed to avoid commenting on directly: the meetings in the Purity basement. They took place at dusk, always at inconsistent times. People were called individually or in small groups, never all at once. Descriptions of these trips to the basement are vague, diffuse, as if the person reporting were trying to reconstruct something seen only partially. A young woman named Margaret, whose testimony was recorded in 1947, said only, "Down there was quiet. They spoke too softly." When the researcher insisted that she describe it better, Margaret refused. "I remember the smell of fresh paint on the walls, but I don't remember the words." The idea of purity, so present in the records, appears more strongly in this context. There are no elements that indicate physical violence or obvious punishment. However, the way the residents referred to the meetings, always hesitant, always with averted eyes, suggests that there was psychological pressure there that was difficult to put into words. It was as if the basement had become a space for forced introspection, a place where each person was led to confront something personal, intimate, but always under the watchful eyes of the twins. The collective coexistence also left its mark. There were reports of nights when residents stayed up late, listening to the wind blowing through the cracks in the house, fearing that the intense silence of the valley would become a mirror of their own fears. Some spoke of strange dreams, not supernatural but disturbing, as if the prolonged confinement, coupled with the harsh winter, created a kind of latent tension in the air. Documents from the general store show that during that winter, the Remmington house purchased fewer supplies than expected for the number of residents. There are records of small purchases: flour, candles, coarse salt, raw cloth. This has led some historians to speculate that the routine in the basement required fewer food resources than usual. Others, however, believe that the Remingtons imposed some kind of rationing to reinforce the idea of purity, reducing excesses, including food. The coexistence among the residents was cordial, but marked by a curious formality. Many were strangers to each other, united only by the fact that they had sought shelter that same winter. Still, later accounts indicate that some children played together on the porch, while women sewed torn clothes or mended blankets. The fire in the fireplace provided not only warmth, but a kind of emotional center, the point where everyone gathered when the cold seemed too great to face alone. It is during this period that subtle signs begin to emerge that something was changing in the dynamics of the house. A letter found in a bedroom window mentions that Elias was stricter than usual, demanding absolute silence after sunset. Another note, hastily written on the back cover of a book, reads, "Abram seems worried. He stands at the top of the basement stairs as if listening to something no one else can hear." There was also a growing sense of isolation. Coldridge Valley was never a busy place, but that particular winter there are almost no records of visitors, deliveries, or outside transactions involving the house. Neighbors mention that the house was too quiet, even by valley standards. Some report seeing less smoke coming from the chimney than usual. Others mention that on the few occasions they saw one of the twins, he walked with quicker steps, his gaze more fixed, as if avoiding prolonged conversation. Still, none of this seemed to point to a mass disappearance. Internal reports continued to show an austere but functional routine. Children still ran down the hall, The fire still burned. Meetings in the basement continued. Meals were prepared. Conversations were restrained. But they existed. It was only when a set of personal items began to be found in unlikely places, a doll left in the hallway, a handkerchief dropped near the porch, a child's hat forgotten by the well, that the first concerns arose among some residents. Small losses, minor oversights, but in a house ruled by order, they were signs that something was out of place. What no one knew at the time was that these scattered details would be the last concrete signs of normality before what was to come, before the dark period in which, according to all subsequent records, 39 lives seemed to converge on the same silent spot at the end of the basement, a spot that, to this day, remains without a complete explanation. The last documented days of the Remmington house are reconstructed from fragments as fragile as the paper on which they were recorded. From that specific week, the one preceding the total disappearance of the 39 residents, almost all that remains are small footnotes, excerpts from testimonies collected decades later, and an administrative silence in the county records that, in itself, already marks the strangeness. The last confirmed mention that everyone was alive appears on a receipt dated January 12, 1900, issued by the Coldridge warehouse. Delivery of salt, ground wheat and kerosene, paid in cash by E. Remmington. After that, the valley plunges into a period in which no other interaction with the house is recorded. There are no more purchases, no more deliveries, no more mail sent. For a residence full of people during the winter, this documentary silence is almost a scream. Reconstructions by historians indicate that the weather that week was particularly inhospitable. The wind blew hard through the cracks, bringing a harsh sound that made the wooden walls seem to vibrate in the early morning. Inside the house, life went on as usual, but in a strangely restrained manner. Before disappearing, one resident left a short note hidden between the pages of a religious hymn. They want absolute silence after dark. Abram says it's to maintain clarity. This phrase, maintain clarity, has become one of the most debated psychological enigmas among researchers. There is no evidence of mystical practices or elaborate doctrines, but the insistence on purity and clarity, coupled with increasing isolation, suggests an internal tension that is difficult to perceive immediately. Something was thickening in the air of the house, although no one could name exactly what it was. In interviews collected decades later, some witnesses who lived in that region reported seeing lights on in the basement at unusual times, thin strips of light escaping from the narrow window that overlooked the lower part of the hillside. One of these witnesses, a farmer named Harold M. Green, stated that one night he heard very low singing coming from that direction. "I couldn't make out the words," he said. "It was like people murmuring together, but it didn't sound like confusion. It sounded like alignment." The testimony was recorded in 1954, when Green was already an elderly man, but the description has a degree of consistency that intrigues researchers to this day. The last collective meal for which there is any trace would have taken place 3 days before the disappearance. A wooden plate found at the site decades later contains circular knife and fork marks that indicate recent but not heavy use. The fireplace, when found by the team that investigated the house years later, contained fresh ashes preserved by the dry climate, as if the fire had been extinguished abruptly, not gradually. These seemingly mundane details form the outline of what would be the last moment of known normality. It is only at nightfall on that day, a night whose exact date has been lost, that the accounts begin to converge. The weather was steady but cold, with wind coming from the north and the moon partially obscured. The house was lit only by oil lamps. The narrow hallway, which connected the bedrooms to the porch, echoed discreetly under restrained footsteps. And the Remmington twins, according to all possible reconstructions, were strangely quiet. A late testimony, attributed to a child who survived because he had left the house days earlier, mentions that Elias kept a notebook always open on the kitchen table, as if waiting for future notes that would never be written. Abram, for his part, spent long minutes standing in front of the door leading to the basement. He held the doorknob but did not turn it, as if he were listening to what was happening downstairs, even when everything remained silent. As the night wore on, the residents began to retire. Some were still arranging blankets. Others tried to warm their hands near the lamp. Children dozed in their mothers' laps. Nothing on the surface suggested that this would be the last recorded night for all of them. But then, in different testimonies and documents, the same detail always emerges: a summons. No one knows for sure how it was announced. There are no records of loud voices or formal calls. Some reports indicate that Abram climbed the stairs from the basement and simply nodded his head to the group gathered in the common room. Others suggest that it was Elias who walked from room to room, tapping lightly on the door with his fingertips, an almost inaudible gesture, but enough to be understood as a call. The fact is that, according to all reconstructions, the residents went down to the basement voluntarily, in small groups, in silence, carrying only what they had in their pockets: handkerchiefs, small belongings, a notebook, a doll, a tin mug. No one took thick coats, no one picked up supplies, no one showed signs of resistance. The descent into the basement seems to have been seen as part of an already established routine, perhaps another of the purity meetings conducted by the twins. The basement door creaked as it opened, letting out a breath of colder air, impregnated with the smell of fresh lime and damp wood. The staircase was narrow, and the steps were worn. The light was dim, coming from lamps attached to hooks on the walls. The purity basement had a low ceiling, whitewashed walls, and long wooden benches leaning against the back. Nothing visually suggested a threat. It was a simple, almost austere space, and at the same time charged with an atmosphere that many describe in retrospect as too compact. As the groups descended, a deep silence fell. The few witnesses who saw the movement from afar, neighbors who still had a partial view of the house, say that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just lights on and shadows moving inside the residence. There were no screams. There was no running. There was no commotion. The last confirmed sighting of any living resident comes from the testimony of a delivery man who was passing by on the highest road in the valley that night. He claimed to have seen, through the side window of the house, Abram Remmington holding a lamp, standing at the top of the basement stairs. His face was motionless, illuminated from below by the yellow light. He seemed to be waiting. It looked like he was waiting for something he already knew was coming, said the delivery man. It wasn't fear, nor urgency. It was resolution. The testimony, although late, coincides with details found in records from that time. After that, the delivery man continued on his way, and nothing else could be observed from that point. It was the last time anyone outside the house saw one of the twins. What happens after that moment is shrouded in absolute silence. There are no records of footsteps returning upstairs. There are no signs of escape, struggle, or external movement. The kitchen table remained tidy. The beds remained made. Personal items remained in their places. Not even the stove in the living room showed signs of having been used after that night. It is in this mysterious interval between the voluntary descent into the basement and the complete disappearance that the most tense point of the case is concentrated. Whatever the explanation, it lies in that narrow staircase, in that cold air of fresh lime, and in that compressed silence that seemed to fill the space between the whitewashed walls. When analyzing the records years later, a researcher wrote a sentence that became symbolic of the case. "I don't know what happened that night, but everything indicates that the 39 residents went in the same direction, and no one came back up the stairs. That is the last confirmed point. The last solid evidence before the case plunged entirely into a documentary void, a gap so large that, no matter how much it is investigated, it remains the dark center of one of the most disturbing collective disappearances at the turn of the century. And most disturbing of all, when the house was finally opened days, perhaps weeks, later, the basement door was locked from the inside. The discovery of the disappearance of the 39 residents of the Remmington house did not happen immediately. Coldridge Valley was an isolated place, where news traveled slowly and routines were sustained with almost no interaction with the outside world. When the first signs that something was wrong began to emerge, no one imagined the extent of what they would find when they climbed the hill and entered the house. The initial trigger came almost by accident. A local merchant, surprised by the Remingtons' lack of activity and prolonged absence of new purchases, sent a young assistant to check on them. It was a dry, windy morning when the boy climbed the narrow path leading to the house. He knocked on the door, first timidly, then insistently. Silence was the only response to his attempts. The assistant walked around the house. The kitchen window was closed, but there were no curtains. He looked inside and saw something that he described years later with evident discomfort. The table was set, plates, cutlery. It was as if they had just gotten up, but no one was there. Frightened, he returned to the store and reported what he had seen to the owner. Within a few hours, 4 men from the community, among them the pastor and the valley's locksmith, decided to go up together to investigate. They did not expect to find a mystery. At most, they expected some illness, an accident, a hasty escape. But when they crossed the front door, what they saw was a house so intact that it seemed suspended in time. The beds were made. Personal belongings remained folded on chairs and trunks. Children's shoes were lined up under a bed. A wooden toy lay in the corner of the room. There were no signs of a struggle or a hasty departure. The only thing out of place was the silence, a silence so deep that it became almost physical. When they called out for the Remmings, for the families, for the children, no voice answered. It was the locksmith who noticed the absence of something important, the smell of the extinguished stove. If they were here, he said, they would have fed the fire before dawn. This feeling of sudden abandonment began to erode the logic of the men investigating the scene. Something was wrong, very wrong. The pastor, moved by an impulse that was difficult to explain, walked to the door that led to the basement, the Purity basement. It was closed. The doorknob was cold. The pastor called out hesitantly, but there was no answer. They tried to open it. Nothing. The door was locked from the inside. The locksmith worked for several long minutes before he managed to break the lock. The sharp click echoed through the ground floor like a muffled thunderclap. When they pushed the door open, the first thing they noticed was the damp smell of fresh lime. Then, the cold. A cold denser than expected, as if the air down there had been trapped for many days. The narrow staircase descended into darkness. Oil lamps were still attached to hooks on the wall, some with oil, others completely empty. But there were no signs of life, not a sound, no movement, no human presence. The men descended slowly. When they reached the basement floor, they saw the benches lined up, the impeccably whitewashed walls, the clean floor. Nothing broken, nothing out of place, but also nothing to explain where so many residents had gone. No visible traces, no marks on the floor, no clothes left behind. It was the pastor who noticed a detail that would later become one of the most debated clues among scholars. Dark, thin, almost imperceptible marks on the back wall, as if hands had slid across it, not violently, but hesitantly. Horizontal marks, at the height of an adult's chest. They weren't scratches, they weren't dirt stains, they were touch marks. A delicate, almost organized sequence, but the floor around these marks was completely intact. The locksmith, intrigued, measured the distance between the benches and the wall. Everything seemed deliberately symmetrical, as if someone had rearranged the basement before locking the door. The question that everyone was asking themselves, but no one was voicing, was simple and brutal. If they went in there voluntarily, where did they come out? The staircase was the only way out. There were no trapdoors, passages, tunnels, or windows wide enough for a child to pass through. Nothing. The architecture of the house was too clear and too old to hide any structural secrets. The men returned to the ground floor and conducted a thorough inspection of the house. Nothing. They searched the surrounding area. Nothing. They examined the well, the abandoned shed, the narrow trail leading to the river. Nothing. The news spread quickly throughout the valley, and within a few days, county authorities arrived on the scene, launching a formal investigation. Records from this stage, unfortunately poorly preserved, indicate that search parties combed the nearby forests, examined hunting trails, scoured stretches of the river, and interviewed neighboring residents. None of them saw any unusual movement. None heard screams, running, carts, or multiple footsteps during the night. The most disturbing discovery, however, was found 2 days later, when one of the investigators was rummaging through a trunk in the twins' bedroom. Among folded clothes and account books, there was a small, loose page, folded in 4, written by Elias. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the content was fully legible. "When everyone is ready, I will close the book." The sentence had no date. It offered no context. It mentioned no names. But there it was, undeniable, like a silent echo of the night when everyone went down to the basement. Other small clues emerged, albeit in a fragmented form. In the room of the widow identified only as L, they found a wooden comb broken in half, but placed gently on the dresser as if it had been a final gesture of organization. In the room of 9-year-old Emma, there was a doll sitting on the pillow, perfectly aligned in the center of the bed. On the porch, the wind gently swayed a child's coat left hanging, as if someone had planned to return to wear it. These details created a contradictory feeling. Something big had happened, but without chaos, without haste, without any sign of disruption. At one point, the authorities tried to impose an official narrative, an organized escape, perhaps accompanied by the Remmingtons, possibly to another county. But the hypothesis did not stand up to any scrutiny. Why would they flee without clothes, supplies, documents, or wagons? Where would they have gone without being seen? How would they have locked the basement from the inside? And most puzzling of all, why were all the clocks in the house stopped at exactly the same time? This detail, mentioned by 2 different investigators in reports found years later, became the centerpiece of the psychological tension of the case. There was no clear technical explanation. Some clocks were wind-up, others were table clocks, and yet they all read 9:17 p.m. It was not supernatural evidence, but an unsettling coincidence, perhaps the result of some collective gesture, perhaps some instruction from the Remmings. All that is known is that this time came to symbolize the frozen moment of that last night. After weeks of searching, nothing was found. No bodies, no objects left behind, no footprints indicating group movement, nothing to suggest a destination. The only certainty that remains, the one that echoes in every statement, every report, every preserved fragment, is that the 39 people entered the basement of the Remmington house together, and somehow they never came back up the stairs. They say that some historical cases do not disappear because they are grand, but because they remain incomplete. The disappearance of the 39 residents of the Remmington house is one of those cases where silence has become part of the archives and emptiness part of the narrative. More than a century has passed since that night when everyone went down to the basement, and yet every attempt to reconstruct the story seems to always lead to the same smooth, whitewashed wall, where nothing can be added without the risk of invention. Over the decades, scholars, curious minds, and chroniclers have tried to organize the surviving fragments. Unfinished notebooks, undelivered notes, incomplete accounts from neighbors, testimonies collected when it was already too late for clarity. Some researchers traveled to Coldridge to examine the land where the house once stood. Today, almost nothing remains. Only rotten wooden foundations and a rectangle of lower ground where the basement once was. The house did not withstand the test of time, but the enigma remained intact. What is most striking when studying the case closely is that none of the known explanations, collective escape, extreme social pact, improvised migration, silent accident, hold up in the face of the evidence. There are no trails. There are no direct witnesses. There are no external signs. There are no reports of mass movement, no wagons leaving during the night, no footprints indicating displacement. The valley, at the turn of the century, was a place where even the slightest noise echoed among the trees. And yet, the night of the descent into the basement seems to have produced no external sound. This silence is perhaps what most attracts the attention of contemporary researchers. Not physical silence, but human silence. The collective or perhaps disciplined decision to descend into the basement without resistance, without haste, and without leaving any signs of doubt. We are not talking about a small group, but 39 people of different ages, backgrounds, and temperaments. The choice, whether voluntary or induced, remains the most delicate aspect to understand from a distance. In many of the academic debates about the case, an uncomfortable question arises. To what extent did the rigid routine imposed by the Remmington twins create a psychological environment conducive to absolute obedience? The preserved records, especially the enigmatic phrase found among Elias's belongings, "When everyone is ready, I will close the book," suggest that there was a mental structure built up over weeks or months, a silent discipline, a belief in order, a surrender to authority. Nothing that indicates fanaticism, but something that, in practice, operated as a social mechanism too strong to be broken from the outside. However, to say that this explains the disappearance would be an exaggeration. The truth is that, given the surviving documents, no conclusion can be sustained with absolute certainty. The gaps are greater than the records. And in this type of case, history must be treated with the same delicacy with which one handles an old paper. Touching it too hard can destroy what remains. Decades later, there are still those who travel to Coldridge Valley without knowing exactly what they are looking for. Some want answers. Others want to feel the place, breathe the dry air where the house once stood, observe the silence that still hangs over the land. The trees have grown around it as if they wanted to close off the space, hide it from any curious gaze. The river, further down, flows slowly as it always has, indifferent to what happened in the winter of 1900. And the wind, when it blows, produces the same harsh sound described in old testimonies. A sound that seems to brush against the skin and disappear before anyone can interpret it. The few indirect descendants of the residents, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, distant relatives, carry fragmented stories passed down orally. Some of these memories speak of a welcoming environment in the Remmington home, others of a rigidity that caused discomfort. But even among these memories, there is no reference to conflicts, threats, or abrupt events that could explain everyone's fate. It is as if, over generations, each memory has been softened until it has become just a whisper. For a historian, this case is a painful reminder of the fragility of human documentation. Archives are lost, witnesses die, papers disintegrate. The truth, when not fixed by solid evidence, becomes vulnerable to disappearance, as vulnerable as the people we try to understand from a distance of time. And at the same time, this void opens space for the past to confront us with questions that we may never be able to answer. When revisiting each report, each note, each mark in the footer of a notebook, it is impossible not to imagine the exact moment when they all crossed the basement door, the sound of footsteps descending the narrow staircase, the lamp flickering in the cold air, the feeling, perhaps shared among them, that they were participating in something greater than they could fully comprehend. None of the records account for this experience. Only historical intuition, which relies more on silence than words, attempts to fill in the scene with the care it requires. The disappearance of the Remmington house is not just an unsolved case. It is an open wound in the fabric of Coldridge's memory. A reminder that history, no matter how hard we try to organize it, is also made up of absences, and that some absences by their very nature will never be fully illuminated. Today, when looking at the valley, nothing reveals what happened there, and perhaps that is precisely what makes the case so disturbing. There is no monument, no plaque, no landmark, just the uneven ground where 39 people once lived, worked, waited, and disappeared without a trace. The researcher who devoted nearly 20 years to studying the case, and who, finally, revisited the archives before retiring, wrote these words in his final report, perhaps the only possible conclusion after so much time. There are stories that do not ask for answers. They only ask that we listen to them with respect. And as he closed his manuscript, He added an almost imperceptible line in the footnote, a reflection that never made it into the published versions, but which was recorded in his personal notebook. The silence of that night continues in some way within us, and with that, the narrative ends, without resolution, without spectacle, only with the stillness that remains when time takes everything away, except for the questions that no one could answer.